Nobody else knows unless you're really bad and your actions are bizarre. But you develop a complex system of obsessions or rituals that you live by. And it's like a prison. Sometimes it can flare up so badly that you just want to die.
Innovation is made possible by the people of NEC. For almost 30 years, providing computer and communications technologies for communities and businesses throughout America. NEC, 8,000 people committed to the future.
Howard Hughes had it, Samuel Johnson had it, and an estimated 4 million Americans have it. Obsessive compulsive disorder, or OCD. Driven by thoughts they know are irrational, these people spend their days performing bizarre rituals over and over. OCD is a doubting disease that forces individuals to wash or check or count for hours on end because they're just not sure they've done something right. Humiliated and depressed, victims of the disorder sometimes turn to suicide. OCD was once thought to be a psychological problem, rooted in unresolved conflicts from childhood. However, recent research suggests that its cause may be a problem with brain chemistry, and new treatment options are becoming available to those who have suffered in secret for years.
Not so long ago, life was not all fun and games for 12-year-old Brian. He was incapacitated by obsessions and compulsions and terrified because he didn't know why.
I first noticed that something was wrong was in the 4th grade, but I didn't really have that much trouble until 5th grade. I found myself keep being very clean and like disliking dust intensely. I hate dust. And I found myself washing my hands a lot.
When Brian would go at the end of the day to go to bed, to walk up the stairs, he had a certain pattern. He had to go up the steps. And if he couldn't do it right, he'd have to start over. And it wasn't just starting over once. He did things in multiples of 4. So that he would, if he didn't make it the first time, then he'd have to go back and just attempt for 3 times, and the 4th time is the one that would really count. And he would try to go up again, and if that failed, he'd go back down and he'd start over. There would be nights take an hour, hour and a half to get him up. I'd say, Brian, I'll carry you up the steps just to get in bed. He said, no, that won't work. That's no good. I have to go up myself.
What I'd have to do is, my number was 4, so I'd have to do like this 4 times. And I'd go like this for 1 time over, and then I condensed it eventually to just 1 big step here, which counts 2. And then I go like this. And as soon as I was done that, I'd be sure not to touch any more of the ground and just walk up the stairs. And if, say, I was to go like this, so the rug would look like, you know, it was upturned like that, I'd have to fix it, go back, and start again. So there's a lot of ways that I could have messed up and had to start all the way over again. So that's why it took me a couple hours a night to get up the stairs.
Brian's room, where he now plays with friends, was the place where his compulsions were most intense.
Every night when he would get into his room, my husband and I would go with him because it would take him so long. We would try and help him along. And he would have a computer chair that had to be folded and put a certain way next to his desk. And then the closet door to his room, the light had to be on, and the door had to be at a certain direction, touching the chair. And he would go through and touch his drawers and make sure they were closed properly. He would open them and close them. He had stuffed animals until he got older, and they would all have to be lined up in a certain order on a certain pillow.
I had to keep my toys in perfect order because I used to have all these little soldiers about that tall, and the little army men. And I had them all lined up on the side of this huge 7-foot aircraft carrier. And there was like 700 of them, and I had them all lined up in perfect order. I'd look at them for like 5 minutes every night, and if so much as one of them wasn't perfect, I'd fix that, and knowing me, I'd accidentally knock over a couple others, have to fix them, and that would go on for about a half an hour. So finally, I just chunked the whole thing.
he just had this series of rituals that would just take a real long time to get him into bed, and sometimes it could be 12, 1 o'clock in the morning. And he would have to get up at 6 for school, and he was completely exhausted. It just took everything out of him.
Brian is a straight-A student, but when the OCD was at its worst, schoolwork was very difficult.
School was awful. I had problems writing or copying notes off the board, and all the kids in my class would yell at me thinking I was just doing this for attention and everything, and they'd yell at me, get real mad and scream. I'd get put out in the hall and stuff like that.
He completely stopped writing. He couldn't handwrite at all. And he would write a word and he would erase it, and it didn't look right to him, and he just kept erasing it 100 times.
I'd literally freak out. I'd cry, scream, get really mad, everything. I just generally get so mad, I just go wacko.
Devastating to see your own child not be able to do things like everyone else.
The eerie part of this disease is that their good friends, the parents, people close to them say what anyone intuitively would say, no, it looks fine, go ahead, what are you worried about? That is one of the most maddening things to say to somebody with OCD, because they know that. They very exasperatedly, as Brian did, say, well, of course I know that, but at another level they don't know that. So he just couldn't write because he was so upset that it wasn't correct writing.
You've written a book called The Boy Who Couldn't Stop Washing. The boy. How common is OCD among children?
We've done a survey to show that it's a surprising 1%, 1 in every 100. Nobody knows for sure what the exact trigger is that started off. Compared to other disorders like schizophrenia and depression, OCD seems to start younger and selectively in childhood in males. No one knows what that means, why boys, girls. Once you hit adulthood, it's equal. Males and females are affected just the same.
Is it a physical malady?
We and several other people have very strong data to say that there's at least a big biological part of this disorder. There's undoubtedly other behavioral parts, and there's a behavioral treatment that's good too. So there's nothing simple in what I'm about to say. But the biological parts are clear. Our study with Sydenham's chorea, where one part of the brain is affected by antibodies, that a third of these patients have obsessive compulsive disorder, and that's a clear demonstration that you get a brain disease and then it causes the disorder. Studies from the 1917 epidemic, encephalitis epidemic, the so-called sleeping sickness, showed that, which affect the same part of the brain, the basal ganglia, showed that one of the post-encephalitic syndromes were people who had to count, wash, do things over and over again.
What treatment worked for Brian?
There's now 3 drugs, one of which is commercially available on the market. Brian was treated with clomipramine in what we call a double-blind study.
Once I started taking clomipramine, I just slowly stopped doing some of the things, very slowly. I just stopped doing some of the things I used to do. Then eventually I just stopped most of them.
Oh, that's my good girl. Yeah.
Mary's OCD also has been helped by medication she takes as a participant in a study at the National Institute of Mental Health.
I've had it since I was about 7 or 8 years old. I remember I had religious thoughts all the time. If I didn't do certain things, I'd go to hell. After I had the baby, that's when it got out of hand. I had kept it hidden for a long time, but I couldn't hide it anymore. When I came home from the hospital, I felt that I was diseased and that I would contaminate everybody, not just the baby. And at one point, I couldn't even look at her. I was afraid I could somehow contaminate her by looking at her. So I avoided her as much as I could, and that was really hard. I had problems making her formula because I was worried that the bottles were contaminated. Even after I'd scrubbed them for a couple hours, I was still worried that they were contaminated with germs. And one day I looked at the rubbing alcohol and I thought, gosh, that sure would be dangerous if I accidentally mixed it in the formula. And after I made the formula, I thought, did I mix the rubbing alcohol in the formula? And I was sure I hadn't, but it was that nagging doubt, and I couldn't rest until I dumped all the formula and started over again. But at that point, I couldn't finish. My husband had to do it. I went through a phase where every time I was driving, I would think I hit somebody, and I'd have to go back and check the side of the road to make sure there wasn't a body. And even though I knew I hadn't done it, it was that nagging doubt that just wouldn't let me be until I checked. When my OCD would flare up, it was usually because the depression was bad, and I would cry a lot, and I would just want to die. I would obsess on suicidal thoughts.
Mary still has some compulsions, but medication has helped her lead a more normal life. Originally, she took the antidepressant clomipramine, also known as anafranil, the drug Brian takes, but she had a problem with side effects.
Here's a prescription for the next...
She recently started on fluoxetine, also known as Prozac, which seems to be effective with less extreme side effects.
The medications that work for OCD are called serotonin uptake inhibitors, meaning that they interact with serotonin to somehow make serotonin work more efficiently in the brain and in the body.
Serotonin is one of a group of chemicals called neurotransmitters. They affect how cells communicate with each other and therefore how circuits of brain activity actually work.
Scientists don't yet completely understand the brain chemistry that underlies OCD. Searching for clues, they've turned to a brain imaging technique called positron emission tomography, or PET scan. PET scanning produces a map showing activity in regions throughout the brain. Preliminary findings indicate that in OCD patients, certain regions are more active than they are in people without the disorder. It's possible that these regions control repetitive thoughts and behaviors.
Another piece of evidence that OCD is not a purely psychological disorder is recent evidence that there's a relationship, possibly a genetic relationship, between OCD and Tourette syndrome, which I think most people would agree is a neurological disorder that also shows up in very complex psychological behaviors.
Mike has suffered from both OCD and Tourette syndrome. His OCD compelled him to spend hours replaying conversations in his mind, symmetrically arranging things in his room, and checking his wallet for credit cards.
No, nothing like that. Nothing like that.
The Tourette syndrome, evident in this videotape shot a year ago, produced motor and vocal tics that he could not control. About half of patients with Tourette syndrome, like Mike, have OCD.
The pain was so intense, the compulsions and obsessions and the Tourette's were so out of hand at the time that all I felt I wanted to do was just shoot myself.
Your blood pressure's good.
As a participant in a study at Yale, Mike is on a combination of medications that has brought the Tourette syndrome and the OCD under control. For OCD, Mike takes an experimental drug, fluvoxamine. He exercises to try to offset the most significant side effect, weight gain. In addition to the drug trial, Mike has participated in another study at Yale. The research indicates that OCD and Tourette syndrome run in families, often in the same families. This suggests that some forms of OCD have a genetic basis.
The findings from the Tourette syndrome family study suggest that the individuals with obsessive compulsive disorder alone in these families represent a variant expression of the syndrome. Another interesting pattern that's observed in the families is that there are more males who show Tourette syndrome and tics than females, but there are more females that show obsessive compulsive disorder than males, so that the findings in our family studies suggest that there is a sex-specific expression of Tourette syndrome and related disorders or behaviors with males being more likely to show the tic part of the spectrum and females being more likely to show the OCD part of the spectrum.
There's clearly at least 1/3 of OCD patients who don't get much better. And some of the more recent research is focusing on what's different about that group.
If we can find a genetic basis for Tourette syndrome or obsessive compulsive disorder or both, and if we can find the gene or genes which contribute to the susceptibility for these syndromes, we expect that it will be possible to develop much more effective treatment strategies.
I know you don't feel like you can touch it now, so I'll start. I'll touch it first, and I'll touch your hands, okay? Okay. All right.
Another treatment approach for OCD is behavioral therapy.
How's the stress?
For some patients, it's effective when used with medication. For other people, like Michelle, behavioral therapy alone has worked.
There may indeed be a biochemical base to OCD. However, it probably would explain why certain people may develop OCD behavior. I don't think it's going to explain the maintenance of the OCD. What's maintaining it is the person's belief that the rituals that they follow reduce anxiety. So remember, the obsession creates the anxiety. For example, I feel contaminated. And the ritual, hand washing, causes the person to feel relaxed, reduces the anxiety. So why don't we just grab the sides of the toilet bowl, okay? Stress?
40.
Okay. In working with Michelle, the major source of contamination in her life was the floor, and the bathroom floor was the hot spot. So everything that related to the floor, or those things which might touch the floor, had levels of contamination associated with them. Now, my goal then became one of causing Michelle to come in contact with gradually with items that would be more contaminated until the point where she could actually touch the floor and not wash.
I was terrified because I knew that I was going to have to touch things that I did not want to touch and hadn't touched in years. And when he actually talked to me through it, and as far as my anxiety levels, you know, worked on it with me to the point where I knew I could do it, I guess I really, at that point, realized that I was going to be on the road to recovery.
Put your hand right on the floor. Okay, good. Stress?
20.
Okay, that's fine. That's fine. You did it. Look what you did.
I know, I did it. I did it.
Public toilet.
I know, I did it. I did it.
The OCD had gotten to the point where it had consumed my life, to the point where I did not want to even tie a pair of shoes. So part of the treatment was almost was like my prescription drug was my sneakers, to go out and buy a pair of sneakers.
For most people, that doesn't seem like a big deal, all right? But remember, when you go into a store, you're going to have to touch several shoes that were touched by other people. You're going to have to work with a salesperson in that process, sit on chairs that were used by other people who were contaminated, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That's not a simple feat. I mean, that's a very involved, complex, demanding, stressful activity.
Hi, can I help you?
Yes. Would you have these in a 7.5?
I'll check.
The experience of OCD is not only contained in the person who's involved, but it extends to the whole family. And certainly, in Michelle's case, it extended to her children.
I was to the point where I could not hold my children's hands. And I trained them to hold on to my pants or to my clothes. But it was to the point where I was so terrified that even, you know, on their own little hands, that they were contaminated, and then if I touched them, that I would become contaminated, that no matter how hard I would want to hold their hands and look at them and love them, there was just no way. I could not help myself. Ooh, what about the sliding pond? Can you climb up on that big sliding pond?
I want to go in the sliding pond.
Oh, Stephanie's going to climb up there. Is Andrew? No? Going outside on a picnic with the kids was actually very close to the end, I guess, of my therapy, where the doctor felt that I should be able to sit on the grounds and, you know, get dirty and roll around in the dirt in the park and be able to function outside. And it was a wonderful experience. Whee! Andrew, hold tight!
A question confronting scientists is why both behavioral therapy and medication, two very different treatments, can produce the same result.
One thing that has been hypothesized is that perhaps even through behavior therapy there are some neurochemical changes that occur.
There are studies with rats showing that if you do avoidance conditioning in rats, you can change the chemistry of the brain, including brain serotonin. We have a collaborative study that we're very excited about with a local behavior therapist. We are doing PET scans, our brain imaging studies, at baseline, sending patients to him for behavior therapy, these selected few who will cooperate, etc., and then repeating their PET scans after they've improved on behavior therapy to see if literally their brain circuits have changed.
There was an OCD patient who attempted suicide, shot himself in the head, but survived, and then his symptoms disappeared. What does that tell you?
That sensationalized, fascinating case fits very well with the best theories about OCD. One of the last strongholds for psychosurgery in this country and others is very severe obsessive compulsive disorder that hasn't responded to any other treatment. With the new drugs, it's becoming increasingly rare. What psychosurgery does is it cuts the connection between the frontal lobes and the basal ganglia, literally the lower nerve knots in the base of the brain. What his accident did was sever those exact connections.
Do animals display behavior that you could call compulsive or obsessive?
We're working on one particular animal model now of animals that pull out their own hair. One version of OCD, we think, are women with the tongue-twisting name of trichotillomania, a disorder known of people who, typically females, and for the most patients are females, who start to pull out their own hair, one hair at a time, usually at about the age of 12 or 13. And we have seen now about 30 women who are virtually bald, who have to wear wigs, some who have to wear false eyelashes and eyebrows because of this compulsion to pull out their own hair. These newer drugs also are dramatically helpful where other antidepressants aren't. And there's an animal disorder of hair pulling. There's several versions of this. There's paw licking in dogs and wool pulling in sheep, and some monkeys pull out their own hair. And we're in the process of looking now to see if the drug would help that.
How are you trying to get to the bottom of all of this?
We have a general theory, which is that many of these behaviors may be evolutionarily meaningful behaviors, that some of the washing might be grooming, for example. Perhaps people who bring so much trash and paper home have something of behaviors reminiscent of nest building. And this has led us to even wilder, and we're quite frank that these are wild speculations, but we've noticed that some of the relatives, the close relatives of our patients, particularly of the ones who pull their hair out that I was just describing, have other behaviors that we never used to think of as OCD. For example, making obscene phone calls, exposing themselves. Could these be sexual display behaviors if you saw them in lower animals? The few patients that I have treated who make obscene phone calls or do expose themselves were otherwise quite straight and normal people who I thought were tortured souls. It is possible that this is a very misunderstood compulsion, and we're in the process of testing out these newer drugs for these conditions also.
We all have habits and preoccupations in our, quote, normal lives. How do you distinguish between something that's normal, ordinary, everyday, and OCD-type behavior?
A lot of the organized habits of everyday life are useful, keep us more efficient, but when they interfere with your life to a substantial degree, then it becomes a severe disorder.
They were getting some reaction with the fluvoxamine, but sometimes it didn't seem to be working, so they would enhance it with another drug. And she was getting these ups and downs, and it was just like a roller coaster from day to day.
At a meeting of an OCD support group, members discuss how existing treatments for OCD vary in their effectiveness. Some people aren't helped at all, others get minimal relief. But for the majority of sufferers who have sought help, life gets better day by day.
Well, right now I feel much better because now I don't have to do a lot of things and I don't get frustrated as easy. My parents have been really good through the whole thing. I know that they're proud of me.
Since I'm better now, I can enjoy my baby. I can hold her and hug her and feed her and do all the things that a mom should do. Now I can do all that.
Right now, I'm doing pretty good. Starting to get back to work, and we're making the best of it. So everything is coming into place.
How about woo? I feel like I'm a new person. I feel like I'm 17 again. 2, 3, woo!
Some of the medication now used for treating OCD is experimental and only available through participation in a study. For information about this and other aspects of OCD, contact the OCD Foundation, Box 9573, New Haven, Connecticut 06535. Until next time, for Innovation, I'm Jim Hartz.
Innovation is made possible by the people of NEC. For almost 30 years, providing computer and communications technologies for communities and businesses throughout America. NEC, 8,000 people committed to the future. For a transcript, send $3 to this address. Please indicate the program subject as well as the station and date on which you saw it. To place a rush order, call the telephone number listed on your screen.